Tuesday marks 5 weeks until the New Hampshire primary, the first primary in the second nominating contest of the 2020 election cycle. A new CBS News Battleground Tracker poll found Senator Bernie Sanders from neighboring Vermont holds a narrow lead in the state over former Vice President Joe Biden. Under our team's pre-election estimate, only 3 candidates would earn delegates based on those results. Sanders and Biden would pull in 9 each, while Warren would earn 6. Is a political science professor at the University of New Hampshire, and he joins me now from Manchester. Professor, thanks very much for being with us.
You're welcome. Good evening.
So Bernie Sanders is up 7 points in New Hampshire since the last edition of this poll in November, while Elizabeth Warren has dropped 13 points since then. Do you have any thoughts on where those shifts came from?
I think the big shift among New Hampshire Democrats was among those more liberal voters who have been going back and forth between Sanders and Warren all year. Now, over the last month or so, after Bernie Sanders' heart attack, ironically enough, has been Sanders' best couple months of the campaign, while Elizabeth Warren, under the spotlight and the glare of increased scrutiny once she became close to being the front runner, has wilted a bit, and people have shifted back towards Sanders, and I think that explains a lot of the movement we've seen in New Hampshire.
Well, when you look at the 2 leaders in this poll, Sanders and Biden, Sanders supporters appear to be much more enthusiastic. Nearly half of Sanders supporters said their mind is made up, compared to just 15% of Biden supporters. Is that something the Biden campaign should be concerned about?
Absolutely. I mean, Bernie Sanders supporters, I mean, that's been the story all year. You're either with Bernie or you're not especially thinking about Bernie as the nominee. Whereas with Joe Biden, I saw him recently at an event in the past week or so, there's a reservoir of goodwill among New Hampshire Democrats for the former vice president, but there aren't necessarily a lot of diehard, dedicated supporters. So if Joe Biden does very well in Iowa, wins that caucus, comes to New Hampshire the next day, a lot of New Hampshire moderate Democrats might say, okay, it's Biden. Whereas if Joe Biden slumps in Iowa, finishes behind, say, not only Bernie Sanders, but Pete Buttigieg or even Amy Klobuchar, then Biden may slide a long, long way here in New Hampshire because, as your poll notes, his support just isn't that dedicated.
Right. And in fact, our polling team asked New Hampshire Democrats what they should take away from the results of the Iowa caucuses. 32% say they can learn which candidates are the real contenders for the nomination, while 37% say there's not much to learn, there is not much at all to learn. So how much impact do the Iowa caucus results tend to have on New Hampshire's primary results?
With a field as crowded as this one is, what Iowa will do is frame the decision and simplify the decision for New Hampshire voters. And it will give New Hampshire a good sense of who's viable, who's quote unquote electable, and who's not. Because we've been debating electability of various candidates all year, but it all gets real once Iowa goes to the caucuses. And then we finally have some actual results, which will tell us winners and losers. So that's what I expect, is that Iowa will give New Hampshire a frame within which to make a decision over that following week.
I want to turn to some new research from last month that you were a part of on the demographic forces reshaping the New Hampshire voting population. You found that 20% of potential voters in the 2020 primary were either too young to vote in 2016 or lived outside of the state. So who are these potential new voters, and what impact could they have next month?
Well, certainly young voters are one reason for that changeover, and they are still giving Bernie Sanders active consideration. They were all for Bernie 4 years ago. This year, there seems to be more of a split between Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. So that's one group of new voters. The other are people who have moved here from other states. One group of those voters are people moving north from Massachusetts, perhaps bringing their families up here for lower housing costs and so forth. And they're settling in the state's southern tier, just north of Massachusetts. And we might think of them as perhaps more moderate Democratic voters potentially. Then there are retirees who move from all over the Northeast, and they might move up into the far northern parts of the state, enjoying the foliage in the fall, perhaps wintering somewhere else, and they bring their politics with them. And what's interesting is that a lot of them are baby boomers who are more liberal, replacing the traditional conservative older New Hampshire voters.
Yeah, it was really fascinating to take a look at some of that research and get the snapshot of the state as it is right now. Well, quickly before we go, I want to ask what New Hampshire voters think about calls to change the order of primary contests so that two states that are 90% white are no longer at the front of the calendar.
Yeah, I think right now that hasn't registered much with New Hampshire voters, although certainly New Hampshire political elites are always keeping a close eye, of course, on any potential threat to the first in the nation primary. And I suspect that if the Democratic nominee, whoever he or she is, loses to Donald Trump in 2020, those local political elites in New Hampshire are going to have their political antenna up for any chance that the National Democratic Party is going to take a hard look at New Hampshire and at Iowa as well, in terms of their traditional roles at the front of the line in the nomination process.
A lot at stake. All right, Professor Dante Scala. Professor, thank you so much for your time.
You're very welcome.
Here's what's coming up tonight on CBSN. At 6 p.m. Eastern, Iran vows to retaliate while the U.S. issues a warning not to. We'll take a look at what a potential war between the two nations could look like. And at 7 p.m., Puerto Rico's governor declares a state of emergency in the U.S. territory following 2 days of powerful earthquakes. We'll have a report from the ground.